Good morning.
Good morning.
Everyone's a little sleepy. Too much pie, maybe. It's a little. Did we miss one?
Okay.
Oh, I think we missed one. How are you? A little cold. Sorry, the heater this morning we had a little foible with it, and once it gets a little cold in here, it's hard to warm it up. But there's good news. Your bodies are some of the best heaters that are around. So if you ever question the meaningfulness of your life, you can, when you come to Buddha Eye, especially in the winter, you can be convinced that you have an important purpose. That is to heat up the room. We do have one of the heaters on, so hopefully you stay warm enough. If you do come in, it's cold. We always keep a big stack of blankets in the back here with the cushions and things, and so that's not always helpful if you're cold and then you wrap in a blanket and you keep more cold in. But those are always there. You can also go, if you go outside and you come back in, it feels warm. Just for a couple of minutes anyway. So I started giving the talk a couple weeks ago, a series of talks titled "The Journey to the Tree of Awakening," and I wanted to talk about the Buddha Shakyamuni's journey to the Bodhi Tree, and I had planned that out to do in a series of 4 talks, and then I had a COVID exposure last week, and so I wasn't able to be here last week, and I believe that you've filled in, so got to hear teaching from Anyu, so thank you for that, and I had to truncate the talks a little bit and fit some things together. I oftentimes give a series of talks about this during the Rohatsu Sesshin, which is the first week of December here at Buddha Eye. We have the day of the Buddha's awakening is celebrated on December 8th. And so here our convention is we choose the week that has December 8th in it. So we go from Sunday to Sunday, and that is a week of meditation here at the temple. And so I'm also usually giving these talks during that time. And I want to focus on something a little bit different this year during the session. So I'm giving these talks earlier. And then I'm going to focus a little more just on right there at the tree during the session. And I know I've said this before, but for those of you who are able to come and participate in the session, that's wonderful. Most people aren't able to do that. Your life isn't the shape that will make sense. The morning sitting and the evening sitting is always open to everyone. So it's really quite a nice thing to do, and to come and sit in the evenings or in the mornings during that week of the celebration of Buddha Shakyamuni's awakening. And you don't have to sign up or anything. You can just stop in or drop by for any of those sittings. And I usually give the teaching in the evening. It's usually the second period of sitting. I say usually. Always is, except when I decide not to do it that way, which happens now and again. So on the first talk, I was emphasizing renunciation, emphasizing the part of the Buddha's story after his birth and being raised in the palace with everything really that a person could want. Protected by his father and cultivated to be a king among kings. And the legends tell us that Shakyamuni was that annoying kind of person who's good at everything and is probably kind and filial and all of the qualities that a person could cultivate. But in spite of his good life, he was unsatisfied. There was something that just didn't gel. Some itch that couldn't get scratched. There was some essential problem. I think this part of the story is so important for us in the modern day life, where we really do have taken care of so many of the kinds of problems that humans have experienced since we've been humans. We still have plenty of problems, don't get me wrong. But we live in, particularly in the industrialized countries, we live in unbelievable wealth and comfort. We have opportunity for education. We have opportunity, think about leisure time, for example. That wasn't really a thing, you realize, right? Wasn't really a thing. So, but now it is for most people, at least in industrialized, wealthy countries. And so, even though we have so much, we find that there is this gnawing issue about being. And we don't know what to do with it. And in Shakyamuni Buddha's case, he decided to leave his life. He left the palace, he left his family, he left his horse. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. And he left all the things that could be protected. He left comfort, he left power, he left position. And what I was emphasizing in the first talk was that oftentimes we focus so much on the renunciation of position or power or comfort that there's a subtler renunciation that's happening there that we might forget to pay attention to. And that is the renunciation of the familiar, the renunciation of the known. I would say even the renunciation of the capacity to know, of knowing itself. You think about your life and all of the fortifications. There in the palace, there is, the very clear fortifications of the walls. But the walls of our mind, the walls of the patterns of our life, the walls of society, the conditioning that we live under, is much stronger than those walls. Those walls are so profound that we don't even see them as walls, right? We just see them as the way it is. And we're constantly have a narrative of telling ourselves, well, this is just the way it is, this is the way it is, this is the way it is, and a confirmation of that. That's our habit. That's how we navigate. That's even maybe how we can walk or hold our bodies upright. There's a very interesting research about how your muscular system works in relationship with psychology and your need to be able to hold something together. And some of these, some of it's very, very woo-woo, right? But pay attention to woo-woo things. A lot of times there's something there. But that our whole, even way that we hold our body is this kind of investment in trying to know my position, know my place, and then to be able to stand my ground. And this renunciation of leaving the palace, the Buddha not only gives up the things that we can identify in a straightforward way, family, position, power, etc., but also gives this up. He's now a wanderer. He's now a seeker. He is homeless or a home leaver. So many of our strategies, our operating system, so to speak, is based in this kind of knowing. And now he walks into the forest. Think about forest. Those of us here in the Northwest, we tend to like the forest, or at least we think we like the forest. Right? And then the actual walking into the forest. Maybe there's a path, right, but you don't know what's there. How do you feel in that situation? It's exciting, I think. But after a while, there's a nervousness. There's a recognition that you aren't protected. If you like to sleep out in the woods, which I'm quite fond of doing, all the sounds of the night. How are those? And you have a chance to come to vistas in which you see over an expanse. Maybe the sun is coming up or the moon's hanging in the sky, and it's magical. But then there's other times where you plunge back into the forest, you can't see anything, and you just have to walk along this path. You don't know where it's going. Maybe you have a map, but if you hike very much, you know that the maps oftentimes don't give you the information that you wish that they would. So this becomes the Buddha's life. My point here is that this is an important facet in practice. We have to see this quality of renunciation. Even though most of us will not give up our house, won't give up our family, we won't give up our vocation, we won't give up all of those things. Some people will, and it's important that some people do. But even though we don't do that kind of literal renunciation, we have to do this kind of renunciation if we're going to actually seek. If we're going to try to find this tree of awakening, we can't do it through knowing in the way that we conventionally think of knowing. Something else is necessary. And so the first thing that the Buddha does as he's wandering is he comes across the great yoga teachers of his time. I'm just using the term yoga here loosely. Alara and Udaka are their names, and they both teach a kind of meditation, and they both have communities. And so first he joins Alara's community, and he learns about this kind of meditation which is known as the abode of nothingness, being able to enter into a samadhi or a concentration in which there's no object, right? And there's great ease there. Or this is what the teaching is. And the Buddha learns this yoga. He becomes very proficient in it very quickly. Remember, he's the rock star. And it isn't long before the teacher offers him the teaching seat. And he says, come and share my teaching seat. And in the legends, I think it's very interesting that the Buddha thinks about it, or the Bodhisattva at this point. He thinks about it. And he says, I'm not satisfied. This doesn't actually scratch that itch. I still have the same fundamental problem. And so he leaves his teacher and he continues to search. And then he begins to study with another teacher named Udaka, who also has a community. He joins the community, he studies with him in the abode of neither perception nor non-perception, is the kind of yoga that Udaka teaches. And so the same thing happens there. He practices diligently. He becomes very proficient at this concentration. And Udaka asks him to become a teacher and to become kind of his successor. The same thing, the Buddha thinks about it. And when he really searches his heart, he finds that it hasn't really taken care of that central question. He's learned a lot. Okay? In this instance, I think he's learned about his mind. It's so easy not to learn about our mind, particularly when we're living a life of success. Right? We don't think about it as our mind. We just think about it as the way things are, and they're going well. No reason to question. Just keep doing a good job, study hard, get good scores on the tests, then go to a good college, then get a good job, do this, do that, and we're kind of just making it all happen. We don't have to be so self-reflective in those times, right? But here, the Buddha finds out about self-reflection. He finds out about how do I learn about my own mind. But that alone doesn't do it. The kind of rarefied states that he's able to cultivate, in a way, are an extension of the previous project. He's gone into a place he doesn't know. He's learned something new. But there's still something at the center that's not getting addressed. He's still pushing forward to accomplish. And so after leaving these teachers, he just takes the opposite approach. He says, well, if getting somewhere, experiencing these deep states of concentration, if that's not going to do it, maybe I should just crush it all. And he enters into the path of asceticism, which would have been also, at this time, as I mentioned before, at the point where the Buddha lived, was a kind of spiritual awakening in South Asia. And there were all kinds of people who were leaving behind the system that was present at that time, which was a system of Brahmins who were born into the caste of the Brahmins, and they did the proper ceremonies to appease the proper deities. And that's what people were involved in, and in the kind of society as a whole. But there were many people who were leaving that system, shramanas, and they were wandering in the forest, and they were doing different kinds of practices. Does it sound familiar to you? So in doing those different kinds of practices, there were different things happening. These kind of yoga teachers was one of the things that was happening. Another thing that was happening was ascetic practice, really profound ascetic practice. And so he becomes an ascetic. And he eats almost nothing, doesn't bathe, lives just with a loincloth in the woods, meditating and enduring. And the idea of this kind of practice is that if we could crush the physical body, not kill it, but bring it, make it weaker and weaker and weaker, then the spirit could emerge in its full glory. And so the idea of weakening the physical body and weakening the desires and weakening all the clingings, that would lead to this kind of spiritual awakening. And it's said that the Buddha practiced for 6 years in this way. Some of the legends are great. They say you could see his spine through his belly. Right? That's one of the images. So he was so skinny that you could see his backbone right here. There's the iconography of the Buddha at this time, which you see in temples. I only really know temples in Japan, but you oftentimes will see these in temples. And there's a Buddha that's completely emaciated, and the rib cage is just like this, almost like no belly, and his eyes are gaunt. Really scary kind of imagery. And so the Buddha tries to just crush everything. Now, the reason I think these two aspects of the practice are so important is because this is just what we do. And you got to find out how it is that you do it. Where do you think you're going to get the secret trick? Where do you think you're going to get the, what were those things we get when we were kids? Cracker Jacks. You get the Cracker Jack surprise in the box, you're going to open it up, and that's going to be the key, right? That's going to solve all problems. Actually, the Cracker Jack price does solve all problems for a short period of time. Right? But that's kind of, we think that, right? Like, oh, I'm going to get this technique. Oh, I listened to this teacher give another talk. Oh, I heard this thing I can do while I'm meditating, or I heard this principle of this or that thing. All of those are wonderful in their own way. But the way that we rely on them is mistaken. We think of them as the trick that's going to solve all the problems, and we use it as a way to protect something, to create a kind of rarefied experience that we can control. Right? That's our mindset about it. And I'm not saying that you might do this. I'm saying you do this. So the legend like this of the Buddha is so helpful to us because it teaches us about what we do. This is a facet of spiritual life, whether you're Buddhist or any other type persuasion. We will try to cultivate that rarefied state in one way or another. And when it doesn't work, it's meaningless. Just crush it all. Squeeze the life out of it. And if I could just get rid of everything, then that's when the prize would appear. This is a kind of bifurcation of our consciousness. And the Buddha's story is teaching us about that. So I like to think about this as the first level of renunciation had to do with protection, had to do with fortification, had to do with knowing, and the Buddha gave that up. That is a kind of self-protection, a kind of self-clinging. And then the second level here is this kind of rarefied experience which we will go after. I would say particularly if you're here at Buddha Eye today, you've touched that, right? Meditation is a kind of like a little bit, that's the advertisement, right? Right? Come and meditate, your life will be better. It will. Okay? But see the mistake in it where you're trying to create this special world. It's kind of self-clinging. And so the Buddha gives that up too. Not because he says these people are horrible or they don't have something to teach, they didn't learn anything. He doesn't say any of that. He does. He says, I learned a whole bunch and didn't really get down to the central problem. So he leaves it aside. And then he says, okay, I'll do what these other people do. Try to just flatten it all out. See what's really there. But it turns out he can't even die. He tries this ascetic practice that he does for six years. He's right on the edge of death. And many of the legends say things like the divine beings that are so, he's destined to become the Buddha, and they have some insight into this. And so they're like, we won't let him die. So they keep like putting in nourishment into his body, even though he won't eat anything, for example. And he can't solve the problem. And he realizes that. He said, even though I'm totally emaciated, I'm still unstable. My mind still isn't settled. I've given up everything. And this moment, I think, is the most important moment of the story of the Buddha's awakening up until being, well, I'm just going to say this is the most important one. This is the turning place. When he relinquishes the ascetic practice, something amazing happens. There's a woman named Sujata, and she lives in a small village that's close to the forest where the Buddha is practicing. And she doesn't have a child, and she wants a child. And so she goes to the forest often to pray to the tree spirits. And there's a beautiful tree there. And she prays to that tree spirit, and she says, please, give me a child. So different than the Buddha's trajectory here. Right? Buddha's leaving his palace, leaving his family, leaving everything behind. And here's Sujata. She's saying, give me something to take care of. Bring life into my belly. And she's praying to what she knows to pray to, which are these divine beings that live in the forest. And so it's said that she starts this prayer right as the Buddha is beginning his ascetic practices. And after 6 years, she becomes pregnant, just at the time that the Buddha is giving up his ascetic practices. And because she has come with child, she prepares an offering for the tree spirit. And the legend is really grand. And all kinds of little details, but I'll just tell you one part of it. A legend says that she decides to make an offering of milk porridge. And so first she takes 1,000 cows. She's very wealthy. 1,000 cows. And she takes all the milk from 1,000 cows and she gives that milk to 500 cows. And then she takes the milk from those 500 cows and she gives it to 250 cows. And she takes that milk and she gives it to 125. Apparently this is it's called revolving the milk. It's a process for making sweeter and sweeter and sweeter milk that cultures that are dairy heavy will do sometimes. And she does this until she gets down to 8 cows. And she takes the milk from those 8 cows and she builds a fire. And the legend's very interesting. They keep saying she milks them with her own hand. She builds the fire with her own hand. And that's an interesting addition. It might just be because she's such an important and wealthy person. Like she would never do that, right? So maybe that's what's getting emphasized. But I feel like there's something else to it. It's important that they are her hands which are doing all this preparation. And she puts the milk in a pot, she puts it on the fire, and she boils it. And in the legend it says that all of these celestial beings gather and they begin to infuse it with all of this kind of nourishment from different realms to make this food for the Bodhisattva. And after it's thickened, she calls to her servant girl and asks her to bring a golden bowl. And she pours the milk porridge into this golden bowl. And then she heads out to the forest to make this offering to the tree spirit. And when she gets there, the Buddha is sitting underneath that tree. The Buddha's given up his renunciate practices, he's bathed, and all of his comrades who were in ascetic practice with him have thought that he's gone soft, and so they left him, and he's sitting there alone underneath this tree. And she thinks he's the tree spirit. And she brings this offering to him, which he accepts. Now, why is this so important? This is the place where the whole trajectory turns. up until here, the Buddha's on this quest. And all the ways that the Buddha knows how to do the practice, to do the seeking, are to put himself forward. Either self-assertion or self-protection in one form or another, to try to discover this tree of awakening or this pivot point of a human life. And none of it works. None of it works to lead him to the pivot point of his own heart. And he knows that. And that's a sensitivity that we need to develop as spiritual seekers. What is that pivot point? What is the center? What is real deep honesty and sincerity about life? And here, he's given up. No self-assertion's possible anymore. He just bathes, and then he sits underneath this tree. And right at that moment, a golden bowl of supreme nourishment appears. And Sujata doesn't think of him as the Buddha. She sees him as a tree spirit. Think about this. The whole world is hungry. And Sujata wants a child. And all the kinds of things that we might dismiss as being unimportant to the spiritual path. No Sujata, no Buddha. All of the turning of the milk of the cows, all of her yearning for motherhood, all of what it takes for human life to be is there in that golden bowl, and it's offered to the Buddha, and now the Buddha can accept it. He couldn't accept it before. He couldn't know its real nourishment. And here Sujata becomes his great teacher, even though she has no idea what it is that she's doing. It's really beautiful. It's this moment in which our own journey can take a turn to a much more profound spiritual seeking than hoping I'll scratch the itch, or chilling out, or calming down, or getting rid of all the extra stuff. All of those parts of the story that we enact over and over again. What is the offering that appears when we let go of our own self-clinging? After Sujata makes the offering, it said that the Buddha receives the nourishment, and then he does this interesting thing. He goes to the river to bathe, and I have to read this part. After he had partaken of the alms food of Ghana milk rice offered by Sujata, the Bodhisattva made the resolution while holding the golden bowl. If I would attain Buddhahood today, may this golden bowl float away upstream. If I would not attain Buddhahood today, let it float downstream with the current. He then let the golden bowl float in the channel of the Naranjara River. The golden bowl cut across the current and went straight to the mid-river, and then floated upstream from there with the speed of a fast-running horse for about 80 cubits, and sank into a whirlpool. On reaching the mansion of Naga King Kala, it hit all the 3 golden cups used by the 3 previous Buddhas, named Kakusanda, Konagamana, and Kashapa, producing clinks, and came to rest under the said 3 golden bowls. On hearing the sound, Naga King Kala said, "It was only yesterday that a Buddha appeared. Today another Buddha appears. And then he rose, uttering words of praise in many verses. So this is another facet of the legend, which it doesn't get told as much, but like I said a couple weeks ago, there's many, many legends, and this one I'm particularly fond of. So you think about this, he's received this golden bowl now. He knows something different. He's able to give his heart over to a kind of a resolve that's possible through receiving offerings, not just putting himself forward, not just trying to either protect or to achieve. He's like, oh, there's a different world here. This golden bowl allows me to see in a different way. It's like an empty space. Like that's what he's discovered, is the space. And he says, now I can give rise to this resolve. And he's going to test it. So he takes this golden bowl and he throws it in the river. He says it'll either flow downstream or will it go upstream? And then I'll know, is this reliable or not? And what is this stream? Well, think about our own life. When you find something really true, when you discover something about the path, do you just get carried away by the circumstances of life? Or does it actually change the direction of how things unfold? That's important to pay attention to. If it's just kind of being carried away by the water, you know there's something that you haven't understood about it fully, or something that's not reliable in that insight that you've had. And so the Buddha here tries it. And it says that the bowl goes straight upstream. But not just upstream, then it goes down into a whirlpool deep into the depths of being where these serpent kings live. And this, the image of this cave where the Naga king lives, it's lined with golden bowls, right? And here the golden bowl of Shakyamuni comes down, and as it's finding its place, it hits 3 of those bowls, right, of the 3 previous Buddhas. And you have this image of the Naga, they're sleeping, and kind of opens his eyes and looks around and says, oh, yesterday a Buddha, today a Buddha again, right? Well, it's really beautiful. Why do I think this part's important? Because again, we are so locked in our sense of trajectory. What is success going to look like? What am I going to be able to make happen? What is my own awakening going to be like? And how do I rush towards it? The awakening that the Buddha has made available to us in this realm is something that's far beyond our sense of time or place. This Naga king, he just experiences it as a day after day after day. In the depths of mind. And it's from that point that the Buddha then stands up and is able to look for the Bodhi tree. And so here, generosity becomes the beginning of the path. Generosity is also the first of the perfections. The 6 perfections, we study that a lot here as a formulation of the Buddhist path. The first is generosity. And when we think about generosity, usually we think about, how am I giving? But here in the Buddha's life, it starts with, how am I receiving? How am I receiving? There's a complete realignment of the spiritual quest when relinquishment meets generosity. When relinquishment it no longer is about getting rid of things, but relinquishment is about an actualization of the space that has the capacity to receive. In a way, this is just what we study in meditation. Even if you don't think about meditation as being particularly Buddhist, if you practice like mindfulness meditation or anything, it's not about how do I control my mind. It's about how do I allow for the spaciousness that can receive. What does it mean to pay attention to something? Paying attention to something is not get really good at holding the object still in your mind. Right? That kind of relationship, just trying to clamp down, is about control. The kind of attention that we practice is saying, no, make the space so that your mind can rest on something. It can pay attention to something. It can receive the presence of. That's very different than trying to hold everything still. The kind of sensitivity that you have in that practice allows you to start to feel for what is really the center of all of this. What is the pivot point? What is the place that I can trust in my own walking? Not the path that was prescribed, not what society told me I was supposed to do, not what I think it means to be successful or good, but what is alive. Right? And we need the world to know that. And so in this way, the Buddha's story is of relinquishment is not just about giving up. It's about receiving and letting our life unfold through that. It's a kind of new discipline. A discipline of stillness, but not a stillness of control, but a stillness of space. Any questions or comments?
Hello, Joseph.
Hi.
So I talked a little bit in a similar vein last Sunday, and what I thought was interesting about what you shared, and I've always loved the story of Sujata. It's just so beautiful. But she becomes pregnant at the same time that the Buddha gives up. And in another version that I found on the internet, when the Buddha leaves, he's reluctant to leave his wife, and so they conceive a child. And the whole time that he's in the desert, she's pregnant with this child. And when the Buddha attains enlightenment, Rahula is born at the same time. So there's a really interesting, to me, I don't know, I'm not sure exactly how to formulate it, but just the intertwining of his enlightenment with the birth of a child seems really important to me. You know, and I think we tend to, in our modern world, you know, we look at the Buddha said he left his child and his wife, and he did, I suppose. But we don't really. I think there's a greater meaning to some of this, especially how the birth of a child and the Buddha's enlightenment seem to be entwined, and they're both really important.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And that they know it. Keizan Zenji in the Denkoroku, which is a writing about about ancestors. In the chapter on Shakyamuni Buddha, there's just one little short sentence that has become increasingly meaningful to me in my life. He says, he says after the Buddha's awakening and he goes and meets with his previous ascetic practitioners and gives the first sermon. He says, and from that day for the next 49 years, the Buddha never even spent one day alone. Right. But think about how opposite that is from what we think the activity of awakening would be. We focus on the solitary Buddha under the Bodhi tree awakening. And even though the Buddha says, I, the great earth, and all beings attain to the way at the same time, even though we hear that and we celebrate it and we believe it, somehow we don't translate it to, and the Buddha never spent even one day alone. The Buddha didn't leave the world, right? He stayed. He stays. Even in parinirvana, the nirvana was the perfect nirvana, which means the Buddha consciousness, the Buddha mind, the Buddha is here. And that the kind of, stupid stuff that we do over and over again, like with our bodies and with our minds and with our lives and with our countries and with our societies, the Buddha's not leaving.
Right.
And that I find really in those stories, in a more like a conventional historical type story, we see that the Buddha's wife and son both become part of the Renunciate Sangha. And in one of the legends, we talked a little bit about this last time you had asked about it, Sokai, the way that it's spoken of is the Buddha thinks, I can't be the father I want to be to this child. I only know how to turn him into a king. And I know that's not going to be satisfying. And so I have to find a different way to live so that I can be the father that I want to be. And then he learns another way, and his son joins the Renunciate Sangha, which is not going to be the way it is for most of us.
Right.
But think about that. What do we have to leave to be able to find a new way? And here in this legend is a very literal way he left them. But oftentimes the leaving that we need to do is not as much of a literal type, like physical leaving. It is the leaving of something that we're stuck in, and to really learn to be a parent. We think, well, I had a kid, therefore I'm a parent. Well, yeah, and that's when we really start learning. And I think this was the same for the Buddha.
Just one other comment that's not the same and not related, but I always find it interesting the presence of trees in all of these stories. He goes into the forest. He's looking for a tree to sit under. Sujata makes offerings to a tree spirit. And there's another version of the story you've told where he goes to a mountain or he goes to a rock.
That's next week.
Next time. None of those places are good enough. He has to be with a tree.
Yeah,
and I just find that really, really important.
Yeah.
And just worth exploring. What is the significance of the presence of trees?
Trees.
And tree spirits.
And it's said that all of the Buddhas woke up under a tree.
Yeah.
So.
We're going to talk about that next week. All right.
Yeah.
I'm working, but I'll try to listen
All
to
right.
it.
Not quite sure how to ask this, but I think it has to do with just receiving the import of what's going on in my life with our cat, who is gravely ill right now. I think there's always, what can we do to save him, or do we euthanize him, or there's these questions about. I don't even know how to talk about this in this context, aside from the fact that I don't know, and also, how could I make a decision to call a vet to come in to take a life, to, there's just, and the relinquishment of allowing him to be in this little cat cave under the bed, and just, I don't know how to empathize with my cat to know what to do in him.
Yeah. Relinquish being right. You don't need to be right. And that's the gift of this story, is that we can actually walk, feel the feet on the ground, and feel the love that you have for this animal, and the direct care and compassion that you intend to embody. because when you don't have to be right, you can make choices out of that place of care. And you won't, it's better that we can't know what is ultimately right. Because that's an illusion.
Right.
But you can be present, and that will break your heart, which is why we mostly don't want to do it, and why we give rise to the idea that there's an ultimate right in which I can just kind of clean up the situation by projecting myself there. But that breaking of the heart is the space which allows us to receive. And you've received the presence of this animal in your life, and as he takes the next steps in his journey, then holding is what that space is about. And that's that loss, I think, is one of the biggest reasons that we don't really know the full functioning of the empty bowl, because it's so painful that we try to turn the empty bowl into something else, not just the receptacle for receiving. So I just encourage you in that way. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It really strikes me that it was milk. Can you talk a little more about milk?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's some of the obvious kind of stuff, which is that it was the agrarian society in that place in that time was, cows were very, very important, milk-based eating, was huge. So there's all that kind of historical things that happen there. But particularly this part of the story where she's revolving the milk. When I think about that, and like I've often encouraged people in these talks, that the images that mean something to you, even if you don't have lots of detail, feel for the images, like let them live in you. And for me, it's just like this stream of white life, and the thickening of that into the offering for the Buddha. Milk is such a potent symbol of nourishment and the non-separation that is nourishment. We think of a baby on a mother's breast. That's like a sublime symbol of our complete interconnectedness. And so to me that makes a difference. That's what it is. There's of course all the historical stuff, but there's also, this is what the Buddha is going to receive. He's a baby now. And now there's a real chance for a different kind of life than the successful life that he had been leading up to that time. There's a teacher in Japan. I wish I could remember his name now, but he started a religious movement in it was in the pre-war period. Like Japan had been closed down for 300 years until the mid-1800s, when Western powers came and said, "You'll trade with us or else." And so there's a big explosion in Japanese society as it began connecting with Western powers and industrialized very quickly, etc. So there's a lot of things that happened at that time, and lots of different spiritual movements came at that time. And he started this spiritual movement. It's known as Itoen, and they have a beautiful compound in Kyoto. If you ever in Japan and have a chance to go to Kyoto, they have a beautiful area. One of my mentors, when I was in high school there, he's buried there. They have like a it's really cool. I know I'm getting off topic here a little bit, but I'll bring it back around, I promise. They have a big sphere, and anyone who wants to can have your cremains put there. And my mentor, he lived in Tokyo, but he was very fond of the cherry blossoms there at the Itoen compound, and he would always go and view them. And so when he passed away, before he passed away, he asked if his cremains could be there. And so I had gone to his funeral there, and that's how I first visited and learned about this teacher. But his great awakening was the sound of a baby's crying. And he was story very much like the Buddha's. He was completely frustrated with life. He had been successful, but he couldn't do it. He left all his life beside, and he's just meditating and trying to make a way. And he took up residence in a little shrine. There'll be these shrines, places all over Japan. Mostly no one lives there. They're not like heated or anything. And he was living there, and it said one evening when he was sitting out on the not porch that's around it, that he heard this baby's cry, and he said he could feel the swelling of the mother's breast, and he just like, boom. And so his whole religious movement was so when a monk goes for alms rounds, the term is called takuhatsu, and you go from door to door. This is from the time of the Buddha, and receive offerings. So he called it takuhatsu, but it was takuhatsu in reverse. You will go to someone's door and you have to ask them if you can do something for them. And then they were very famous for cleaning toilets. They would go out just like droves of people. Once he had a lot of followers, they would go out into Kyoto and just ask people if they clean their toilets. And people were always asking him, from the books that I read, they would ask him like, well, I went to the door and I asked if I could help people, and they wouldn't give me anything to do. And he would say, your heart isn't pure. You didn't ask humbly enough. He said, if you ask really with no expectation, even for any like spiritual salvation for yourself, and he said, if you have anything ulterior motive about helping people will smell it on you and they'll say no. But if you go with a total humility, then people will let you help them. So the space that he taught his students to create was a receiving, but it was a receiving that also came from an offering of assisting. So I think it's very interesting, his awakening, and then the kind of discipline that he took up, and then he started teaching to his students, is similar, but almost in the kind of from 180 degrees the other way.
Do you know if his practice is still extant?
Yeah, so whenever I go to Kyoto, which isn't that often, but probably more often than most of you, then I always go there and offer sutras for Professor Woodruff, who's really my first teacher, and it's the community's starting to dwindle. Young people aren't wanting to stay, but that's why we need societal collapse every once in a while, because these seeds they can't always they can't flourish when the forest has lots and lots of easily fruit-bearing things like blackberries. So, I'm hopeful. Yeah.